The Duchess's birthday had always been an event of quiet elegance, but this year, the estate seemed to breathe grandeur. Light spilled from towering windows into the evening gardens, where lanterns swayed gently in the warm air. Inside, the ballroom shimmered beneath crystal chandeliers, each prism scattering golden reflections across polished marble floors. Nobles, dignitaries, and members of high society filled the space with laughter carefully measured and conversations delicately restrained. Every detail had been arranged to perfection: flowers imported from distant lands, musicians trained in the finest courts, and a feast prepared to impress even the most critical eye. At the center of it all stood the Duchess. She wore a gown of deep ivory threaded with silver, its intricate embroidery catching the light with every subtle movement. Her posture was flawless, her expression serene, yet there was something distant in her gaze, something only the most observant might notice. She greeted her guests with practiced grace, offering smiles that never lingered too long, words that never revealed too much. To the world, she was the embodiment of refinement, but beneath the elegance, her thoughts drifted elsewhere. The Duke had not yet arrived. It was not unusual for him to be late, but tonight carried a different weight. This was not merely a social gathering, it was her birthday, a day that once held meaning between them. Years ago, he had remembered such things. He had stood beside her, not out of obligation, but with a warmth that now felt like a distant memory. Somewhere along the years, that warmth had faded into indifference, and indifference into something colder still. Rumors had begun to circulate in recent months, whispers carried through corridors and behind gloved hands. The Duke was often seen elsewhere, his attention captured by diversions that did not include his wife. The Duchess had heard them all, of course. It was impossible not to. Yet she had never confronted him, never allowed the rumors to fracture her composure. She had told herself that dignity required silence, that patience might one day restore what had been lost. Tonight, however, she allowed herself a fragile hope. Perhaps he would arrive with intention. Perhaps he would remember. Perhaps for one evening he would stand beside her not as a title but as a husband. The music shifted and a subtle ripple moved through the crowd. The doors had opened. Every eye turned instinctively, anticipation flickering across faces. The Duchess did not move at first. She felt it before she saw it, the shift in the air, the sudden stillness, the tension that replaced easy conversation. Slowly she lifted her gaze toward the entrance. The Duke had arrived, and he was not alone. At his side stood a woman no one could mistake for anything but a deliberate statement. She was striking, undeniably so, with dark hair cascading freely over bare shoulders and a gown that clung rather than flowed, its bold design defying the quiet elegance expected in such a setting. Where the Duchess embodied restraint, this woman radiated defiance. She did not lower her eyes, did not soften her presence. Instead, she walked forward with confidence, her hand resting lightly on the Duke's arm as though it belonged there. A hush fell across the ballroom. The Duchess felt it like a physical force pressing against her chest, stealing the breath she had so carefully controlled. For a moment the world narrowed to a single, unbearable clarity. This was no rumor, no misunderstanding, no private indiscretion hidden behind closed doors. This was public, intentional. The Duke's gaze swept the room, acknowledging the attention without discomfort. When his eyes finally met hers, there was no apology in them, no hesitation. Only a calm, almost detached recognition, as though he were observing something inevitable rather than something he had chosen. He approached her slowly, the woman still at his side. "My lady," he said, his tone smooth, almost courteous. "I trust the evening has been satisfactory." The words settled heavily in the space between them. The Duchess inclined her head slightly, her expression unbroken. "It has been as expected." A faint smile touched his lips, though it held no warmth. "Good, then allow me to introduce." "There is no need," she interrupted softly. For a fraction of a second, something flickered in his eyes, surprise, perhaps, but it vanished as quickly as it appeared. The woman beside him studied the Duchess with open curiosity, her lips curving into something that might have been amusement. "Still," the Duke continued, undeterred, It would be improper not to acknowledge a guest. The word echoed with quiet cruelty. The Duchess did not respond. She simply stepped aside, granting them passage as though they were strangers arriving at a gathering she merely hosted. Around them, the crowd began to move again, though the atmosphere had changed. Conversations resumed in hushed tones, each glance carrying speculation, judgment, or thinly veiled fascination. The music resumed, but it no longer filled the room in the same way. The Duke led the woman onto the dance floor. It was not subtle. It was not restrained. He offered her his full attention, guiding her through the steps with an ease that spoke of familiarity. She laughed openly, her voice carrying above the music, unburdened by decorum. Where the Duchess had once stood beside him, there was now only absence. The Duchess remained where she was, her hands lightly clasped before her. One dance became another. Guests began to watch more openly now, their curiosity outweighing their caution. Some avoided the Duchess entirely, unwilling to be drawn into the spectacle. Others approached with forced politeness, offering hollow compliments that dissolved into awkward silence. Then, as she turned slightly, she heard it. "She has always been distant," a voice murmured nearby. "One cannot blame him entirely." And another replied. "Hardly suitable, but at least she seems lively." A soft laugh followed. The Duchess closed her eyes briefly. So this was how it would be rewritten. Not as betrayal, but as inevitability. Not as cruelty, but as consequence. When she opened her eyes again, something within her had shifted. The fragile hope she had carried into the evening dissolved completely, leaving behind a clarity so sharp it felt almost cold. This was not a momentary lapse. This was a declaration, and she would answer it. Slowly, deliberately, she raised her hand. The ring caught the light as she slipped it from her finger. For a moment, she held it in her palm, its weight suddenly unfamiliar. Then she stepped forward, crossing the room with a calm that silenced even the quietest whispers. The music faltered as she approached the dance floor, the movement drawing every gaze once more. The Duke turned as she neared. She extended her hand, placing the ring into his. "Then she is welcome," the Duchess said softly, her voice carrying with effortless clarity, "to what I release." No anger, no tremor, only finality. Before he could respond, before the room could fully absorb what had been spoken, she turned, and she walked away, not hurried, not broken, but with a quiet, unshakable resolve that no one present would ever forget. By morning, the entire city knew. What had unfolded in the ballroom did not remain confined to gilded walls and polite society. It spilled outward into drawing rooms, carriage rides, and whispered conversations over morning tea. Each retelling shifted slightly, embellished or softened depending on the speaker, but one truth remained unaltered. The Duchess had removed her ring and walked away, leaving the Duke standing before half the aristocracy in stunned silence. Some called it scandal, others called it courage. The Duke called it nothing at all. At first, he dismissed it as a passing display of pride, a calculated gesture, perhaps, meant to remind him of appearances. He had expected her return by dawn, or at the very least, a letter filled with restrained indignation. That was her way, measured, composed, predictable. But dawn came and she did not return. Her chambers remained untouched. Her attendants, when questioned, knew nothing beyond what had already been seen. She had left without announcement, without escort, without instruction, without him. The absence settled slowly at first, like a quiet draft through the corridors of the estate. Servants moved more cautiously, their usual rhythm disrupted by an unspoken tension. Meals were prepared but left unfinished. The vast rooms, once maintained with meticulous care, seemed to echo more than before. Still, the Duke refused to acknowledge it. He continued as he always had, surrounding himself with distraction. The woman he had brought to the ball, bold, vibrant, unapologetically indulgent, remained at his side. She filled the silence with laughter, the kind that demanded attention rather than earned it. Where the Duchess had brought order, this woman brought chaos, though at first it seemed almost refreshing. Guests still came, though fewer than before. Conversations grew sharper, less forgiving. The spectacle that had once amused now lingered uncomfortably. The Duke noticed it in subtle ways, the hesitation before greetings, the careful avoidance of certain topics, the absence of invitations that had once been guaranteed. Weeks passed. The novelty faded. The woman who had seemed so captivating in defiance revealed herself more clearly in time. Her interests were shallow, her affections conditional, her presence demanding rather than supportive. She had no understanding of the estate, no patience for its responsibilities, and no respect for its traditions. What had once appeared as confidence began to resemble entitlement. The household suffered for it. Accounts went unchecked. Staff grew disorganized. Small inefficiencies grew into larger problems, each one unnoticed or ignored. Where the Duchess had quietly ensured everything functioned seamlessly, her absence exposed how much had depended on her unseen effort. The Duke began to notice, not all at once but in fragments, a missing document, a poorly managed event. A servant dismissed without reason, only to be replaced by someone less capable. Each inconvenience was minor on its own, yet together they formed a pattern he could no longer ignore. And beneath it all there was something else. Silence. Not the absence of noise, but the absence of something steadier, something grounding. The Duchess had never been loud, never demanding, yet her presence had shaped the very atmosphere of the estate. Without her, everything felt slightly off, as though the foundation itself had shifted. He found himself remembering things he had once overlooked. The way she had anticipated needs before they were spoken. The quiet efficiency with which she managed both household and reputation. The restraint she had shown, even when given reason to break it. Moments that had seemed insignificant at the time now returned with uncomfortable clarity. Regret did not come immediately. It began as irritation, then unease, then something heavier, more difficult to dismiss. Meanwhile, far from the estate, the Duchess began again. She had traveled without fanfare, leaving behind not only her title but the expectations that came with it. The place she chose was modest in comparison, a coastal town where the air carried the scent of salt and the pace of life was slower, less burdened by pretense. Here she was not watched, not judged, not defined by her marriage. At first, the transition was quiet. She took a small residence overlooking the sea, its simplicity a stark contrast to the grandeur she had left behind. There were no chandeliers, no endless corridors, no carefully curated gatherings. Only open skies, restless waves, and time, something she had not truly possessed in years. She allowed herself to feel, not all at once but in measured moments, the pain of betrayal, the weight of humiliation, the exhaustion of maintaining dignity in the face of disregard. Each emotion surfaced, was acknowledged, and slowly released. She did not suppress it, nor did she allow it to consume her. In its place, something stronger began to form, clarity. She began to rebuild her life with intention. Her education, once confined to polite accomplishments, revealed deeper value when applied freely. She managed her own affairs, learned the intricacies of trade within the town, and quietly invested in local ventures. Her decisions were thoughtful, precise, and increasingly effective. People began to notice, not her title, which she did not use, but her presence. Her composure remained, but it was no longer restrained. It was chosen. She listened more than she spoke, observed more than she revealed, and in doing so earned a respect that was neither forced nor expected. Where she had once endured, she now directed. The transformation was not dramatic, but it was undeniable. Back at the estate, the Duke's unease deepened into something sharper. He began to ask questions, at first discreetly, then with growing urgency. Where had she gone? Who had seen her last? The answers were frustratingly incomplete, each lead dissolving into uncertainty. Until at last one did not. A letter, a report, a quiet confirmation. It did not matter how it reached him. What mattered was what it revealed. She had not disappeared. She had chosen to live without him. The realization struck with a force he could no longer ignore. For the first time, the possibility that she might never return became real, and with it came something far more unsettling than scandal or inconvenience. Loss, not of reputation, not of control, but of her. He set out to find her, not as a duke issuing commands, but as a man driven by something he did not fully understand until it was already too late. When he finally arrived, he did not recognize the life she had built at first. And when he saw her, standing not as his Duchess but as herself, he understood something with sudden, irreversible clarity. She had not been waiting. She had moved on. The sea stretched endlessly beyond the cliffs, its surface shifting between silver and deep blue beneath the late afternoon light. A steady wind carried the scent of salt and distance, tugging gently at the edges of stillness that defined the quiet town. The Duke had expected many things when he came: anger, bitterness, perhaps even relief. What he had not expected was this calm. He found her standing near the edge of the cliffside path, her figure outlined against the horizon. She wore no jewels, no elaborate gown, only a simple dress that moved softly with the wind. There was nothing diminished in her presence. If anything, she seemed more complete, as though something essential had finally settled into place. For a moment he did not approach. He simply watched. This was the woman he had married. The same face, the same posture, the same quiet strength, but stripped of everything that had once confined her. There was no expectation in her stance, no waiting. She was not looking for him. She did not turn when he stepped closer. "I wondered how long it would take," she said, her voice even, as though she had sensed him long before his arrival. The Duke stopped a few steps behind her. "You knew I would come." "I knew you would realize," she replied. "Eventually." The words settled heavily between them. For the first time in years, he found himself without an easy response. The authority he carried in every room felt strangely absent here, as though it had no place in the quiet honesty of this moment. "I was wrong," he said at last. The admission felt unfamiliar but not insincere. She turned then, her gaze meeting his. There was no visible anger, no trace of the hurt he remembered leaving behind, only clarity. "Yes," she said simply. The absence of accusation struck him more deeply than any confrontation could have. "I did not understand what I was doing," he continued, the words coming slower now. I believed you would remain no matter what I did, that it was your role, your duty." "And now?" she asked. He hesitated. Now the certainty that had once guided him felt hollow. "Now I see that I mistook your patience for permanence, your silence for acceptance." A faint shift passed through her expression, though it was not quite approval. "You mistook it for permission," she said. The truth of it left no room for defense. The wind moved between them, carrying the quiet weight of everything that had been left unsaid for too long. "I have come to ask you to return," he said, more carefully this time. "Not because of expectation, not because of appearance, but because He stopped, the words faltering under their own weight. "Because I need you, because I cannot undo what I have done, because I finally understand what you were." None of it felt sufficient. She watched him, waiting. "I was a poor husband," he said instead, "and I cannot change that, but I can change what comes after if you would allow it." For a long moment she said nothing. The silence was not empty, it was deliberate. "You believe this is about permission," she said at last. "That I must decide whether to allow you the chance to become what you were not before." "Is it not?" he asked. She stepped closer, though the distance between them remained unmistakable. "No," she said, "this is about consequence." The word landed with quiet finality. "You made your choice," she continued. "Not in a moment of confusion, but in a moment of clarity. You brought another woman into my home, into my life, and you did so knowing exactly what it meant." He did not look away. "I know." "And now," she said, "you have come to ask me to erase that choice, to return, and in doing so make it as though it never truly mattered." "That is not what I ask," he replied quickly. "I ask only for the chance to repair," she finished. "Yes." She studied him for a moment longer, as though weighing something beyond his words. "Some things cannot be repaired," she said. "They can only be understood." The distinction was not subtle. The Duke felt it settle into him, heavy and undeniable. "I do not expect forgiveness," he said, "only the opportunity to earn it." She exhaled softly, her gaze shifting briefly toward the horizon before returning to him. "And if it is not given?" she asked. The question lingered, suspended between hope and inevitability. "Then I will accept it," he said, though the cost of those words was clear in his expression. For the first time, something in her demeanor softened, not with affection but with recognition. "You have changed," she said. "Not enough," he admitted. "No," she agreed. "Not enough to undo what has been done." The honesty of it left no room for illusion. The wind picked up slightly, stirring the quiet space around them. "When I left," she continued, "I did not do so to make you follow. I did not leave as a test or as a plea to be understood. I left because I had already understood." He felt the weight of that more than anything else she had said. "I understood that I could remain," she went on, "and continue to endure what you chose to give me, or I could leave and choose something else." "And you chose yourself," he said. "Yes." The simplicity of it carried more power than any declaration. He looked at her then, not as his Duchess, not as something that belonged within his world, but as someone entirely separate from it. "And there is no place for me in that choice?" he asked quietly. She held his gaze steady and unwavering. "Not as you were," she said. The answer was not cruel, it was precise. "And as I am now." He pressed. Another pause, another moment of careful consideration. "That," she said, "is not something you can ask me to decide today." A flicker of something hope perhaps crossed his expression. "You would consider it?" he asked. "I will consider whether the man standing before me is truly different from the one I left behind," she replied. "Not in words but in time." It was not forgiveness, it was not refusal, it was something far more difficult to earn. The Duke nodded slowly, understanding the weight of what she was offering and what she was not. "I will remain," he said. "As long as it takes." She turned then, her gaze returning to the sea. "You will not remain for me," she said. "You will remain for yourself. That is the only way it has meaning." The distinction was clear. He did not argue. For a while they stood in silence, the space between them no longer defined by distance alone, but by the fragile possibility of something not yet determined. The past could not be undone. The future, however, had not yet been decided. And for the first time, that uncertainty did not feel like loss. It felt like truth.